December 19th, 1944. A converted French army barracks in Verdun. The room was thick with tension, suffocating. The most powerful generals in the Allied command sat around a table, and not one of them was smiling. Their faces were grave, etched with worry. 3 days earlier, something impossible had happened. Over 200,000 German soldiers had smashed through American lines in the Ardennes Forest like a sledgehammer through glass. The offensive had caught Allied intelligence completely by surprise, completely and utterly blind. American units were being overrun, surrounded, annihilated. The reports coming in were nightmare fuel. Entire divisions cut off, communications severed, men dying in the frozen forests with no hope of relief. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had called this emergency meeting to figure out how to stop the disaster. But as he looked around the table at the grim faces of his generals, he knew the truth. They were losing. The situation wasn't just desperate, it was catastrophic. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, trapped like rats in a cage. If that town fell, German armor could split the Allied armies in two and potentially reach the coast. The entire war effort in Europe could collapse within weeks. Eisenhower leaned forward, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The question he asked was critical, perhaps the most important question of the entire war. How soon can someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? The room went dead quiet. Generals stared at maps, their minds racing, calculating logistics, troop movements, supply lines. They were thinking about the distances involved, the brutal winter conditions, the absolute chaos of disengaging units already locked in combat. The answer seemed obvious to everyone in that room. It was impossible. It would take weeks, maybe longer. Then George Patton spoke. His voice was calm, almost casual. "I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals turned and stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. Some thought he was joking. Others thought he was grandstanding, making wild promises he couldn't possibly keep. Just 2. Look good in front of Eisenhower. 48 hours. To disengage 3 divisions from active combat. Rotate an entire army 90 degrees. Move over 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles through snow and ice. And launch a coordinated attack against hardened German positions. It was operationally impossible. Every general in that room knew it. The logistics alone would take weeks to plan, but Patton wasn't bluffing. He wasn't grandstanding. His face was serious. He was the only general in that room who had seen this attack coming, and he had been preparing for it for 11 days. The question wasn't whether he could do it. The question was, how did he know?
The primary advance will proceed along this axis toward the objective.
10 days before
Secondary
the Verdun
forces
meeting,
will flank here to secure
Patton's
the supply
headquarters
lines.
in Nancy,
The advance
France.
must proceed along this
Colonel
axis.
Oscar Koch
Secure the flanks of
walked
these
into
positions.
Patton's office,
Report back
carrying
immediately.
a stack of intelligence
The enemy
reports
advance
that
follows
would
this
change
route.
the course
We
of
must
the
intercept them at the river crossing.
His hands were
Deploy the
steady,
reserves
but
immediately.
his eyes betrayed his concern. Koch was Patton's G2, his chief intelligence officer. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and right now deeply worried. He had been tracking German unit movements across the Western Front, and he had noticed something that nobody else seemed to care about. Something terrifying. 15 German divisions had vanished. These weren't small units. These were full-strength divisions, including several panzer divisions with hundreds of tanks. They had been pulled off the line and moved somewhere, but Allied intelligence couldn't find them. They had simply disappeared into thin air. Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the SHAEF, had an explanation ready. The Germans were holding these divisions in reserve to respond to Allied breakthroughs. Nothing to worry about. Just defensive posturing from a beaten enemy. Koch didn't buy it. Not for a second. He had been studying German patterns for months, learning how they thought, how they moved, how they fought. The Wehrmacht didn't hold divisions in reserve just to react. That was offensive strength. That was enough combat power to launch a major attack, Maybe the biggest attack since D-Day. Koch spread his maps across Patton's desk with deliberate precision. He pointed to the Ardennes Forest, the thinly held sector where American divisions were spread across miles of front, like butter scraped over too much bread. "General, I believe the Germans are planning a major counteroffensive. The target is here the Ardennes." Patton studied the maps in silence, while Koch laid out his case. The evidence was damning. The Ardennes was the weakest point in the Allied line. 4 American divisions were holding a front that should have required 12. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested, with narrow roads nearly impossible to navigate in winter. That's exactly why Schaeff wasn't worried. The same terrain that made the Ardennes hard to defend also made it hard to attack through. No sane commander would launch a major offensive through that terrain in December. But Koch reminded Patton of something chilling. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that. They had attacked through the Ardennes and reached the English Channel in 6 weeks. It was the campaign that conquered France, that put all of Europe under the Nazi boot. History was about to repeat itself, and no one was listening. Koch had more evidence, pieces of a puzzle that everyone else refused to see. German radio traffic had increased dramatically in the sector. Prisoner interrogations mentioned new units, arriving fresh troops, well equipped. Local civilians reported unusual activity behind German lines. Convoys moving at night, the sound of tanks in the forests. German officers surveying roads. Patton asked Koch a direct question, his eyes locked on his intelligence officer. "If you're right, when does the attack come?" Koch's answer was immediate, no hesitation. Within the next 2 weeks, Patton picked up the phone and called Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. He laid out Koch's analysis, point by point, the evidence building like a prosecutor's case. Bradley listened, but the Schaeff intelligence disagreed. The war was almost over. Germany was beaten on its knees. They didn't have the strength for a major offensive. It was impossible. Bradley told Patton not to worry. Then he hung up. Patton put down the phone and looked at Koch. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the maps spread across. Over the next 10 days, Patton's staff worked in secret, like conspirators, preparing for a coup. They developed 3 complete contingency plans for responding to a German offensive in the Ardennes. Each plan was detailed down to the minute truck routes calculated, fuel supplies prepositioned, artillery batteries designated for rapid redeployment, infantry units assigned specific roads and assembly points. The plans covered every variable, every possibility. If the German attack came from this direction, Third Army would execute Plan A. If from another direction, Plan B. If the situation required a different response, Plan C. Nothing was left to chance. Patton's staff thought their general had lost his mind. Third Army was engaged in offensive operations in the Saar region, pushing toward Germany, winning the war. Why were they planning for a defensive emergency, 100 miles to the north? But Patton trusted Oscar Koch more than he trusted SHAEF. And that trust was about to be vindicated in the most horrible way possible. 5:30 a.m., December 16, 1944. German artillery erupted along an 80-mile front. The sound was apocalyptic. Thousands of shells slammed into American positions, turning peaceful winter forests into hellscapes of fire and steel. Then the infantry came, waves of them, screaming out of the darkness. Then the tanks, their engines roaring like beasts. 3 German armies, over 200,000 men, mashed into 4 American divisions. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 4-1. Units that had been in quiet sectors for rest suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives. Communication lines were cut, commanders lost contact with their troops. Chaos reigned. At Schaeff headquarters, the first reports were dismissed as a local counterattack. Nothing serious. It took hours for the scope of the disaster to become clear. And when it did, there was disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Allied intelligence had assured them the Germans were finished, beaten, incapable of offensive action. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and positioned in the Ardennes for what was supposed to be a quiet introduction to combat, was virtually destroyed. 2 entire regiments surrendered, the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. Young men who had been eating breakfast that morning were now prisoners, marching into German captivity. But at Third Army headquarters, the reaction was different. Patton received the first reports and immediately summoned his staff. There was no surprise in his eyes, no panic. He looked at Oscar Koch with an expression that was almost grim satisfaction. "You were right. What's their objective?" Koch studied the incoming reports, the patterns of attack, the directions of German thrust. His answer came quickly. "Bastogne. They need the road junction, and then Antwerp." Patton nodded. "Get me General Gaffey. We're executing the contingency plans." While every other American headquarters scrambled to understand what was happening. To make sense of the nightmare unfolding in the Ardennes, Patton was already giving orders. Third Army began disengaging from combat operations in the SAR. The other generals would spend 3 days trying to figure out how to respond. Patton had figured it out 11 days ago. Asked how soon someone could attack north to relieve Bastogne, and Patton said 48 hours. The silence that followed was deafening. Generals looked at their maps,
Signal spiking, adjust the
calculating the
modulator.
impossible distances.
Compensating now, level stabilizing.
Eisenhower
Good. Monitor
pressed
for drift.
him, his voice hard. "George, this is no time for grandstanding. The 101st Airborne is surrounded. If we promise relief and can't deliver, those men die." Patton didn't blink. "Ike, I've already given the orders. Third Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans prepared. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days." The other generals stared in shock, expecting it. How could Patton have expected something that caught SHAEF completely by surprise? Eisenhower studied Patton for a long moment. He had known Patton for decades, knew when he was bluffing and when he was deadly serious. Patton was serious. "All right, George, get moving." Patton left the meeting and made one phone call. 2 words: play ball. Those 2 words activated contingency plans, prepared 11 days earlier. Within minutes, orders flowed through Third Army's communication network, like electricity through wire. Over 133,000 vehicles began moving through snow, ice, and narrow roads. Units in combat that morning would be in combat again, 100 miles away, within days. The movement was breathtaking in its scale and precision. By December 21st, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division were in position. They had moved over 100 miles, in less than 48 hours, through the worst winter weather in decades. Miracle. Patton wasn't performing a December 22nd, Third Army attacked. The fighting was brutal, vicious, yard by yard through frozen hell. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held on, low on ammunition, low on food, low on medical supplies. When the Germans demanded their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his famous one-word reply, "Nuts." The paratroopers weren't giving up. They knew relief was coming. December 26, 1944, 4:50 p.m., Lieutenant Charles Bulge, commanding the lead tank Cobra King, pushed through the final German positions. His tank made contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. That night, supply convoys rolled into Bastogne. The 101st Airborne had held for 8 days. Against overwhelming odds, the Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month, becoming the bloodiest battle the American Army fought in World War II. But the losses would have been far worse without Patton's relief of Bastogne. After the war, captured German commanders revealed the truth. They had expected the American response to be slow, confused, disorganized. What they hadn't expected was George S. shocked them, disrupted their entire timetable. They had calculated it would take the Americans at least a week to mount a serious counteroffensive. If it took Patton for days. The intelligence failure haunted American command. But the lesson was clear. Intelligence only matters if commanders act on it. SHAEF's analysts had decided the war was almost over and interpreted every piece of evidence through that assumption. Oscar Koch approached the evidence differently. He asked what it actually showed. But having good intelligence wasn't enough. Other commanders received Koch's analysis and dismissed it. Only Patton listened. Only Patton prepared. And when the attack came, only Patton was ready. Patton was the only general ready for the Battle of the Bulge. Not because he was lucky, not because he was reckless, because he was prepared. And in war, preparation is everything.